What if a silent man with nothing left to give met a barefoot girl with no one left to turn to? And together they built something stronger than blood. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of choosing family through frostfire and every whisper that said they couldn't belong. Stay with us, because the moment they planted that cedar, everything changed. They say the river never forgets. That morning, the Eel River churned beneath a gunmetal sky, swollen from winter rains, its current fast and unfriendly. It wasn't a morning for mercy. The wind tore through the redwoods like it carried a grudge. The town of Garberville, huddled at the foot of the mountains, didn't stir much in weather like that. Folks stayed inside, curtains drawn, fires lit, doors shut tight. But Elijah Brooks was already on his porch, a man who hadn't felt the cold in years, because grief had done far worse to him than winter ever could. He sat wrapped in an old wool coat that had once belonged to his father. His boots were scuffed unmoving, planted on cracked planks. The coffee in his hand was untouched, half frozen. He wasn't staring at anything, just letting his memories rise and drift like steam into the air. You could say he was half living, half waiting, until someone changed all of it. He saw her from the corner of his eye. At first, just a blur near the bend of the riverbank, thought maybe it was a deer or his imagination. But as the figure came into focus, Elijah's back straightened. It was a child, a girl, and she was barefoot. That alone was enough to punch the breath out of him. Her coat was too thin, sleeves frayed. She stood still as a stone arms wrapped tight around her frame. Her hair clung to her cheeks, soaked by mist. Her feet were red raw against the frost-hardened earth. But she didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just stared into the rushing current like it might carry her somewhere else, somewhere quieter. Elijah stood, slowly, so as not to spook her, even though she hadn't noticed him yet. He didn't speak, didn't call out. He simply turned into his cabin, ladled leftover stew from a dented pot into a wooden bowl, broke cornbread with calloused hands, and carried it outside. He set the bowl and bread gently on the edge of the porch, halfway between his door and the wild world beyond. Then he stepped back inside. He watched her through the window. Minutes passed. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves spinning across the clearing. Still, she didn't move. Elijah could see her blinking now, slow and deliberate, like each blink was a decision. Then finally she took one tentative step. Another. Her toes curled into the icy dirt. She approached like a stray animal ready to bolt at any sound. She reached the porch. Her hands, small and cracked, lifted the spoon. She ate in silence, eyes flicking to the door now and then, but never knocking. Elijah stayed where he was. Didn't interrupt her moment. Didn't dare ruin whatever thread of trust had started spinning itself from the silence between them. She finished every bite. She placed the bowl back where it had been. Then she sat. Right there on the porch legs, crossed back straight eyes still trained on the river. She didn't leave. That night, Elijah didn't lock his door. He left it slightly ajar. He didn't sleep much, just lay on his cot listening for movement. But none came. When the sun rose again, soft and pale behind a curtain of fog, he stepped onto the porch and saw her curled beneath the bench wrapped in the quilt he'd draped over the railing before he went to bed. She hadn't taken it with permission. She hadn't needed to. The wind had calmed. The river flowed quieter that morning, as if even it was waiting. Elijah brewed fresh coffee, made oatmeal, toasted the last of the cornbread. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand her story. He simply set a second plate beside his own on the porch table. She didn't hesitate this time. She climbed up slowly, cradled the bowl in both hands, and began to eat. Elijah sipped his coffee and looked out at the river. "Bad place to get lost," he said, finally. The girl looked at him, and for the first time he saw her eyes, not just the color muddy green, but the storm behind them. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror. She didn't answer, but she nodded. After breakfast, she stayed. When Elijah went to the barn to feed the goats, she followed. When he split wood, she sat nearby, watching, not interfering. She didn't speak. Not one word. But that night, when he lit the oil lamp and set a small flute carved from driftwood on the mantel, her fingers lingered on it. She didn't play, just held it like it was the only thing in the world that didn't scare her. She slept in front of the fire that night. Elijah gave her the cot. Took the chair himself. By the third day, she swept the porch without being asked. She helped crack eggs into a skillet and wiped her fingers on her coat like she had always belonged there. He found himself waiting for her humming, which came in short bursts, always quiet, like she was testing the air. By the end of the week, Elijah carved her name onto a wooden plate, not because she told him, but because he asked to see the journal he'd left on the table with a pencil beside it. Inside, in careful blocky letters, she had written it herself, Lily. He ran his thumb across the page, not a signature, a declaration. He brought her a bowl of stew again that night, and when she took it, she said the first word he'd heard from her lips. "Thanks." He nodded, then asked the only question that mattered. "You staying, Lily?" She didn't answer right away, but when the fire dimmed and the wind rattled the window once more, she whispered back, "If you'll have me." And just like that, the world shifted. The river still ran. The wind still howled. But on that porch in Garberville, a story began that no storm could wash away. The days settled into a rhythm, the kind that forms only when two people are learning each other by instinct rather than instruction. Lily moved through the cabin with quiet purpose. Her presence felt more in what she didn't say than in what she did. Elijah noticed the way she folded the blankets with care, how she lined her boots next to the door, though they still had holes, and how she stood still for long moments, eyes fixed on the flicker of the fire. One morning, she was already outside when Elijah opened the door. She was scattering breadcrumbs for the birds, humming a tune so faint he had to hold his breath to hear it. When she saw him, she didn't stop, only kept humming and crumbling bread like it was the most natural thing. And somehow it was. That was the first time he thought, maybe she's healing. They began doing chores side by side, feeding the goats, mending the coop, collecting eggs in an old woven basket. Lily watched Elijah like someone who had been waiting for instruction her whole life. She didn't need praise. She needed consistency. That evening, Elijah handed her a pair of worn mittens. They didn't match, and one had a hole in the thumb, but she took them like they were made of gold. The next day, she was wearing them while stacking kindling by the shed, whistling softly under her breath. Later that week, he built her a stool from leftover lumber and set it near the fireplace. She spent hours there, sketching with charcoal on scraps of old newspaper images that seemed half memory, half dream. A woman's face. A field. A fire. Elijah never asked, and Lily never explained. In return, she began cooking small meals on her own. A boiled egg, toast from the last of the flour. She'd leave a plate for him with a folded napkin and a note. Once it read, "Thank you for staying." Another time, "This feels like safe." Not safety, just safe. It was enough. One night, thunder cracked over the ridge. Lily, startled, dropped her cup. It shattered. Her breathing came fast. Elijah sat beside her on the floor and said nothing. Just sat. In the silence, she gripped his sleeve, for a long time. That was the night she played the flute again. Not for him, for herself. The next morning, he found a new drawing by the window. It was of a tree, and two people standing beneath it holding hands. She was choosing this place. This quiet, this man, and he was choosing her right back. Still, Elijah knew healing wasn't linear. Some days Lily would wake with tears already falling. Other mornings she would vanish for an hour into the woods behind the barn, only to return with her face pale and her hands clenched around pine cones or feathers like talismans. He didn't follow, but he always left the door unlatched. On one of those days she found an old shoebox under Elijah's cot filled with his wife's belongings, threadbare gloves, a comb, a broken brooch. Lily sat with the box in her lap, her thumb running circles along the edges. When Elijah returned from the barn and saw her there, he didn't scold. He simply said her name was Ruth. Lily nodded, and that evening she placed a new drawing above the mantel, a woman's hands cupping a flower. Beneath it a single word, remember. Later that week, Elijah carved a nameplate for the stool she sat on by the fire. It said, Lily's Place, in letters that weren't perfectly straight but were carved with care. When she saw it, she didn't say anything, but she sat a little taller. She began to talk more after that. Slowly. Not in long sentences, but in careful observations. The fire sounds tired today. Your beard looks like the old goat's. The wind smells like snow. Each sentence a thread. Elijah took them gently, wove them into conversation, never tugging too hard. She asked about the seasons, about trees that held their leaves, about birds that didn't fly away in winter. She asked if people could forget how to cry. He said no, but they could forget how to let it matter. One afternoon they walked to the edge of the ridge. The wind there was fierce. Lily pulled her coat tight and reached for his hand. He gave it without pause. Together, they watched the horizon. He pointed out the town far below. She asked, "Do you think they wonder where I went?" He answered honestly, "Maybe, but not the way I do." That night, she brought out the flute again, not to play, but to teach Elijah how to blow a note. They sat for nearly an hour while he tried. Every time he failed, she laughed a sound as rare as spring rain. When he finally got one note to sound, she clapped her hands and beamed. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him like that. At the end of the week, she wrote 3 words in her journal and left the page open on the table. I feel home. Elijah didn't speak when he saw it, just put the kettle on and poured 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for her. She sat across from him, pulled her stool closer, and hummed. And the cabin, once filled with the echoes of silence, now held the echoes of something far more tender belonging. She stayed. It began with the sound of hooves on frozen dirt, a steady, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo long before anyone could see who approached. Elijah was in the barn that morning, patching a broken gate when he heard it. A quiet foreboding crept down his spine, the kind that had nothing to do with weather or wolves. When he stepped outside, the wind had died. The forest, the birds, even the river, it all felt like it was holding its breath. A man on a tall black horse came into view, his silhouette framed by the weak sunlight slanting through the redwoods. He wore a wool coat buttoned high and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. But his posture was sharp, and the letter he carried was clutched in a gloved hand like it might solve everything or shatter it all at once. Lily was in the garden, humming and arranging pine cones along the windowsill. When she looked up and saw the stranger, her body stiffened. She dropped the last pine cone and stepped back slowly. Elijah was already moving toward her. The man dismounted, tied his reins to the porch post, and tipped his hat politely, though his eyes scanned the property like he was already taking inventory. "Elijah Brooks?" the man asked. "I am," Elijah replied evenly. "My name's Walter Hill. I've come regarding a child." "Lily." Behind Elijah, Lily froze in the doorway. Walter's eyes flicked to her, softened just a fraction, and he pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I believe this belongs to her. It was a birth record, faded, watermarked, with her full name, Lillian May Carter, and a date that matched what little Elijah had pieced together. "She's my cousin's daughter," Walter continued. "She was listed missing after the accident. Her folks died near Ridge Creek." Lily stepped further back into the shadows. Walter's voice lowered, but didn't lose its edge. "I've come to take her home." Elijah didn't speak right away. He looked to Lily, saw her eyes wide with fear, not confusion, not relief. It told him more than any piece of paper could. That night, the town called a meeting in the old Grange Hall. Every seat was filled. People who hadn't shown up for Sunday service in years came that night. The baker, the barber, the sheriff. Folks came not out of gossip, but because they'd seen the change in Elijah. And in Lily. Walter stood at the front with his papers in hand. He spoke clearly formally about family ties responsibility, what the law said. "She's blood," he said, "and blood matters." Then Elijah stood. His voice was softer but firm. "I didn't plan to find her," he said. "I didn't expect to be needed again, but I was there and I stayed." He turned to the crowd. "I don't have the right last name. I don't have papers. But I gave her a place to rest. I watched her learn to breathe again. I listened when she couldn't speak. I stayed when she ran into the woods, and I stayed when she came back." There was a pause, not heavy, holy. Then Lily stepped forward. She wore the blue coat that no longer seemed too big and the boots Elijah had found for her. She held her journal, her fingers trembling just slightly. She opened it. Her voice, though small, carried to the back of the room. "He may not be my cousin or my uncle or my anything on paper, but he didn't ask me to prove I was worth staying for. He just stayed." A murmur moved through the crowd. Sheriff Thomas' arms folded, watched silently. Walter looked down at the letter in his hand, as if the words had blurred. Lily continued. "I don't remember what my parents looked like. I don't remember what home felt like. But I remember the first bowl of soup he gave me. I remember the fire. I remember feeling warm for the first time in a long time. And I remember the day he made me a stool and carved my name into it." She turned to Walter. "You don't know me. You didn't look for me. You just found a paper." Walter looked up. His face wasn't cruel. It was tired. He met her eyes and saw something there, something like peace, something like resolve. The judge had not yet ruled. There were more steps, but the town had heard all it needed. Sheriff Thomas stood. "Sometimes," he said, "family isn't found in bloodlines. It's found in the fire you build, and the hands that help you carry the wood." That night, as Lily and Elijah walked home under a sky filled with stars, neither spoke. But when they reached the porch, Elijah turned and looked at her. She looked right back, and in the quiet she said, "He's not home." Elijah nodded. "I know." Then they stepped inside, shut the door, and the wind outside, so loud for so long, finally quieted. The fog rolled in like a secret, that morning, quiet and deliberate, covering Garberville in a soft gray hush. The redwoods stood tall and silent, their trunks like sentinels watching a ceremony no one had yet named. At the edge of Elijah's property, just beyond the barn where the world had begun to turn again, for both of them the ground had been cleared. A small hole had been dug beneath the oldest tree, and beside it sat a young cedar sapling, no taller than Lily herself. There was no announcement, no parade, but the town came. They arrived in twos and threes, Sheriff Thomas with his hat pressed to his chest, the baker with a tin of warm biscuits, the schoolteacher with a wool shawl for Lily. No one said why they came. They didn't need to. In small towns, actions speak long before words ever do. Elijah stood beside Lily, who wore her blue coat and a red ribbon someone had gifted her that morning. She held the sapling close like it might slip away if she let go. Elijah handed her a small wooden plaque he'd carved himself. It read, "Lily and Elijah, family by choice." She ran her fingers over the lettering, nodding once. Then together they knelt. Elijah patted down the earth around the roots, and Lily added the water they'd drawn from the well. It wasn't much, but it felt like enough. When they stood, the sapling wavered slightly, then held. He stepped back, allowing her the space to place the plaque into the soil. The moment it stood upright, the wind picked up rustling through the redwoods, carrying with it a sense of finality or perhaps a beginning. Someone behind them sniffled. No one turned to look. Then Lily did something no one expected. She pulled from her coat pocket the small flute Elijah had given her weeks ago. She raised it to her lips and played not a full melody, but a series of soft, uncertain notes. They trembled in the air, lifted by the breeze, and echoed into the forest like a vow. When she finished, she looked at Elijah. "I want it to grow," she whispered. "It will," he said. That evening, after the crowd had drifted back to their homes, and the light had faded to a warm gold across the clearing, Elijah poured 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Lily, who sat by the window, sketching the new tree in her journal. He watched her a long while, remembering the girl who had once arrived with frostbitten feet and eyes too old for her age. And now this same girl was drawing roots. "I think we should give it a name," she said suddenly. Elijah blinked. "The tree," she nodded. "Yes, for what it means." He considered. "What about Ruth?" Lily smiled. "For your wife." "For beginnings," he said. She always believed in those. She wrote the name beneath her drawing. Over the next few days, life continued as it had. Chores were done. Meals were cooked. The goats bleated and the fire crackled. But something had shifted. It was as if the house itself had decided to breathe again. Elijah built a wooden frame around the young cedar to protect it from the deer. Lily strung a few wind chimes from the low branches, old spoons, bottle caps, bits of glass. When the wind blew, it sounded like laughter. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the judge. It was official now. Elijah was Lily's guardian, not just in spirit, not just in action, but by law. He read it twice, folded it carefully, then handed it to Lily. She didn't say much, just traced her fingers over the paper, then placed it in her journal. Later that night, she added another plaque beneath the first. This one said simply, "I stayed." As fall deepened, Elijah noticed how the light hit the cedar differently each morning. Some days, Lily would sit beside it for hours, writing or drawing, or simply being still. He never interrupted her. That space belonged to her just as much as the stool by the fire, or the mug with her name carved into the handle. Then, one day, Lily asked if they could invite the town, to what Elijah asked. To witness, she said. And so they did. Under a sky that threatened snow, but held off out of reverence, the townsfolk came again. A bench was built beside the cedar. Candles were lit. Elijah said a few words about what it meant to choose someone, and Lily read a letter she had written to the town. "I didn't know where I belonged," she said. "I didn't know if I ever would. But I know now. Not because someone told me, but because someone stayed. And staying is a promise. One that grows. There wasn't a dry eye among them." As the gathering ended, Mrs. Hampton, the baker, pressed a cinnamon roll into Elijah's hand. For the girl, she said, though, he noticed she had made 2. Later that night, Lily lit a single candle by the cedar tree. She whispered something to the wind. And though Elijah didn't hear the words, he understood. Some roots don't begin in the ground. They begin in the heart. And when they take hold, they grow forests. They grow family. In the weeks that followed, Garberville seemed to shift just slightly, but enough for those paying attention to feel it. The frost was thicker now in the mornings, but there was something in the way the townspeople lingered near Elijah's porch, or how Mrs. Hampton always made 2 extra biscuits instead of 1. Belonging, it turns out, doesn't arrive like thunder. It seeps in like warmth through old floorboards. The cedar tree Lily and Elijah had planted grew taller by the day, its trunk slowly thickening, the wind chimes dancing in the breeze. But more than that, it became a quiet landmark. Children would stop on their way home from the schoolhouse to touch the plaque, running their fingers along the letters like it held a secret just for them. Tourists who happened through town were told it was just a tree, but those who lived in Garberville knew better. Lily had begun to teach herself how to read from the old almanac Elijah kept by the stove. She traced the letters with slow precision, whispering them aloud like she was coaxing stories out of hiding. Elijah watched her sometimes, pretending to sharpen tools or tend the stove, but really he was just listening to the soft murmur of her discovery. She didn't ask for help. But one evening, after a long pause over the word believe, Elijah pulled a chair beside her and pointed to each syllable with the end of a matchstick. "Believe," he said gently. "It means to hold something true, even when it's hard." She nodded and repeated it, then asked, "Is that what you did with me?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked toward the cedar and said, "I just stayed, and sometimes that's the same thing. That winter, Lily asked if she could decorate the barn, not for the holidays, just to make it feel more like theirs. She strung old lace bits of ribbon and pressed dried flowers into jars. She painted symbols on the wall in chalk, simple ones, stars, hearts, a tree. Elijah helped her hang tin lanterns that flickered with candlelight every evening. On one particularly cold night, Elijah came in from chopping wood and found her in the loft laying out a small quilt on a makeshift table. A candle flickered beside it. There were 2 cups of tea, and in the middle a pine cone wrapped in twine. "What's all this?" he asked, taking off his gloves. She looked up, her smile gentle. "I wanted to thank you for not making me talk before I was ready." Elijah sat beside her. "Talking isn't always the beginning," he said. "Sometimes it's just staying close enough for someone to feel safe." She nodded. "You did that." Then she reached into her pocket and handed him a small wooden carving rough around the edges, but clearly a man and a girl standing beneath a tree. He held it like it was made of gold. The following week, the town newspaper printed a short article titled "A New Kind of Family." It was penned by the schoolteacher, and it simply told the story of Elijah and Lily, not with grandeur, but with truth. She described the day Lily arrived, the planting of the cedar, the quiet witness of the townspeople who had come to understand that family wasn't about names, but about effort, about choice. Elijah read it aloud to Lily by the fire. When he finished, she didn't say anything. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. Later, she added the article to her journal, pasting it carefully beside a drawing of the tree. That spring, something remarkable happened. Lily stood in front of the baker's shop one morning, looked up at the townsfolk gathering for their weekly market, and raised her voice. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," she said. "That maybe I was something people forgot." No one interrupted. Even the children stilled. But then someone stayed, she continued. "He made space for me, not because he had to, because he wanted to, and that made me feel like I was worth staying for." She looked directly at Elijah, who stood at the edge of the crowd. "So now I stay too." There was a long silence before someone began clapping. Then another, and another. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. A quiet applause that echoed far louder than any shout. Later that day, Elijah and Lily walked back to the cedar. They brought with them a new ribbon, bright green, and tied it to the lowest branch. Then, in quiet ceremony, they pressed their palms into the earth and buried a small metal tin beneath the roots. Inside were Lily's earliest drawings, one of her first journal pages, and a note from Elijah that simply said, "You were never alone." As they stood, Lily asked, "Do you think it will remember us?" Elijah smiled. "It already does." That night, as the wind rustled the redwoods and the chimes tinkled in their gentle song, Lily took out her flute and played again. But this time it wasn't hesitant. It wasn't a whisper. It sang. And in that song lived every meal shared in silence, every chore done side by side every day they chose each other. In that song lived the promise of belonging not just for her but for anyone who'd ever wondered if they were worth loving. The music floated over rooftops, over fences into homes that once held doubt and now held hope. The townsfolk paused to listen, some leaning against windows, others wiping their eyes. And the town, in its quiet, redwood-wrapped way, understood. Sometimes the strongest families are the ones you build from pieces, and sometimes the most powerful vows are the ones made without words. She belonged, because he stayed, and because she chose to. And long after the last note drifted into the night, the wind carried with it not a chill, but a promise, one that would root itself into Garberville's soil and hearts for generations to come. As the years folded one into another, the story of Elijah and Lily rooted itself not just in Garberville's history but in its very soul. It became more than a memory. It became a quiet melody that lived in the creak of the porch, in the swing of the barn door, in the rustle of cedar needles above the hill. This wasn't merely the story of a man and a girl. It was the story of how love, when freely given and fiercely defended, can transform not just a life, but a whole community. Elijah had not intended to become anything more than a silent man trying to forget. And Lily had not set out to find a home, only a moment's warmth. But what began as a gesture, one plate of food, a coat draped across frail shoulders, grew into something neither had planned for a bond forged through everyday courage. They had survived the frost of isolation, the fire of judgment, and the silent test of time. When they planted the cedar, it was more than a symbol. It was a vow. That promise to stay, to nurture, to defend echoed in every heartbeat after that. Lily, once voiceless, stood tall beside it, and Elijah, once buried in sorrow, found his voice in quiet actions that echoed louder than any speech. Together they showed Garberville and anyone willing to listen that family is not confined to birthright. It is built, and that building takes time. It takes the morning chores, the mending of fences, the patience of teaching a child to read or tie her boots. It takes hearing someone's silence and not rushing to fill it. It takes being there not just once, but over and over in small ways that gather weight with every repetition. The town changed too. Mrs. Hampton, who once peered skeptically from behind her curtains, now brought extra biscuits every Sunday. Children stopped to touch the plaque beneath the cedar, as if it held some magic. The sheriff, who once questioned Elijah's right, became the first to nod when Lily addressed the town that spring day. Her words, trembling but clear, touched something sacred. "He stayed," she said, and in those two words was the essence of the tale. He stayed not out of duty but devotion, not because it was easy but because it mattered. And that is what made the town stay too, not just in place, but in spirit. They bore witness to love's quiet revolution. Their story wasn't without hardship. There were whispers, long winters, and difficult questions. There were days when grief tried to creep back in, when Lily would stare at the ridge and remember when Elijah would sit too long with the coffee gone cold. But even in those moments, they chose each other again. That choice became the drumbeat of their days. Lily became a young woman who read aloud in the barn loft, who taught other children how to plant herbs, who carved not just her name but her future into the redwood grain. Elijah aged into a man who no longer walked hunched by sorrow, but upright with pride, his face softened by years of love given and received. And when the town faced its own trials, storms, fires, and loss, It looked to that cedar and remembered the strength that comes not from bloodlines but from bonds. The tree grew tall, its roots steady in the soil that had seen so much, and beneath it, Elijah and Lily buried tokens of their beginning, a carving, a journal page, a note that read, "You were never alone." That was the truth of their legacy. They redefined what it meant to belong, not through ceremony or decree, but through presence, through the act of staying. And now, dear listener, this is where we look beyond Garberville, beyond Elijah and Lily. Because this story, though rooted in a frontier town and etched with snow, belongs to all of us. In every corner of this world, someone is looking for a place to feel safe. Someone is waiting for a sign that they matter, that they are worth choosing. Perhaps you are that someone. Or perhaps you are the one being called to stay for a child, a friend, a partner, a neighbor. What Elijah and Lily teach us is simple but not easy. Show up. Stay present. Let love speak in actions. Hold space for silence, for grief, for the long, slow work of healing. You don't need to be a hero. You don't need grand gestures, just kindness repeated. Just patience offered again. Just warmth even when the world is cold. And as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what seed can you plant today? What cedar of compassion can you nurture in your world? Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's listening without rushing to fix. Maybe it's believing in someone who hasn't yet found their voice. Let this tale be your invitation to love not with conditions but with consistency, to offer safety not judgment, to be the reason someone says, "I stayed." Because in a world spinning with noise, what we remember most is the quiet courage of those who stayed when it mattered most. So, if this story touched your heart, if Elijah and Lily's journey reminded you of the kind of family you wish to build, or the kind you've been lucky to find, we invite you to walk with us. Subscribe to our channel. Help us share more stories like this of resilience, of tenderness, of ordinary people becoming extraordinary through the simple act of showing up. Your support keeps this community alive, rooted, and growing. There are more tales to tell, more hearts to mend, more cedar trees to plant. Thank you for being here. And remember, belonging doesn't whisper, it sings. And today it sings for you.